Surf 102.5 Podcast.
The BBC is the public service broadcaster in the United Kingdom with journalists based around the globe. Jonathan Head is the Southeast Asia correspondent for BBC News, Radio and Television based in Bangkok. I asked Jonathan about the role of the BBC overseas.
Well, the role of the BBC overseas is a very old one. It goes right back to the foundations of BBC World Service in the 1920s when it was felt that an impartial news service was a necessary adjunct of sort of Britain's interests, I suppose you could say. It played a very big role during the Second World War when BBC channels were used to relay information to people opposing the Nazi occupation. And during the Cold War, the BBC ran more than 40 language services, many of them going into the Soviet bloc and to other countries where it was deemed that impartial information, independent information wasn't available. People in those days listened on shortwave radios, and it was quite an effort, and it was often pretty scratchy sound. It's evolved. Of course, the BBC have to separate between the BBC people get back in Britain, which is paid for by a license fee. It's these days a somewhat controversial method of funding because it's based on whether you own a television set. It's a very old-fashioned method of funding, but the British public pays and they get in return all the services available in Britain, and that's all the channels everyone knows: BBC One, BBC Two, radios 1, 2, 3, 4, all the regional radios, BBC Scotland, BBC Wales and so on. But overseas, in the past, the BBC World Service was funded by the Foreign Office. It was in effect an arm of foreign policy, although it was editorially independent. Yeah. The Foreign Office got to choose which languages were broadcast. And after the Cold War, that kind of faded away, and also nobody really wanted to listen on shortwave radio, and media became more sophisticated in other countries. But the BBC has had a kind of revival in its World Service output through the use of social media and other web technology to get information out into countries where, again, it's deemed it's needed, and the Foreign Office is funding that as well. At least it's been funding it up to now. We're not sure how much longer that goes on for. Part of that is BBC Thai. BBC Thai is very popular in Thailand, and that was revived after the coup in 2014 and now has quite a high profile here. But of course, you also get BBC World TV. That has to be commercially funded. It can't be funded by the license fee. So there's advertising there. There's advertising on the website, which people in Britain don't see. So the global arm of the BBC is supposed to be separate from the domestic funding. And of course, BBC World Service Radio in English still survives. It's very popular in Africa, for example, which probably explains why people who do listen to the radio version probably hear a lot of a kind of African bias. It's quite popular in the United States. It's rebroadcast on a number of public radio stations, yeah, and various other countries too. And what you're getting on your station essentially is the main BBC World Service Global News Bulletin that goes out every hour on BBC World Service Radio.
What about yourself? How did you get into journalism, and what was the fascination with it?
Well, it was a kind of accident, really. When I left university, I was very interested in Southeast Asia. I travelled there in my year after leaving university. I'd studied Southeast Asian and developing country politics, and I think that kind of eventually led me there. I wouldn't say it was a choice of a career. I actually did a number of different things before I started in journalism. I worked for a human rights group. I lived in the States for a while. I did a master's degree in London. I sort of dithered around. But I found a way into BBC World Service, a rather strange little route in a small department where I got a trainee scheme. This is way back in the mid-1980s. And eventually started my career properly at BBC World Service at the beginning of 1989. And that was working in London, and I worked on programs there, did a little bit of work on BBC World TV, and then moved to Indonesia, which was a country I knew a lot about, at the beginning of 1996, thinking at the time I'd have a 2-year break, spending time in a country, getting to know it well, and then go back to my job in London. Well, that was 25 years ago, almost to the day, and I'm still out in this region. Most of it, these 25 years, have been in Southeast Asia or East Asia, in Japan or Singapore, yes, Thailand, Indonesia, and I did spend 3 years based in Istanbul during the time of the Arab uprisings, the Arab Spring, which was, of course, a very interesting time to be there.
Yeah, it's actually a very familiar story, actually. I think I did the same sort of thing. I came out here 30 years ago for about a year and stayed. So you've done...
It does happen, doesn't it?
Quite a few
Unplanned,
people
your whole
do
life
this.
changes.
And what about Thailand? Why did you decide to come and get based here in Thailand? Or was that a BBC initiative?
Well, it was a logical thing to do after my first 4 years in Indonesia. I mean, I'd gone to Indonesia when it was quite a quiet story. I was a beginner correspondent. I'd never done proper frontline reporting before, or very little of it. And in the 4 years I was there, Indonesia became very dramatic. You know, we had the fall of the then Suharto regime, in effect an overthrow of an authoritarian government, a lot of chaos. There was a lot of communal fighting. I got very involved in the birth of East Timor as an independent country, which was very violent as well. And at the end of that, the BBC thought it was a logical step up for me to go and be the Southeast Asia correspondent. I spent a bit of time reporting in Singapore before I came to Thailand at the very end of 2000. And at that stage, I'm not sure I'd had any plans to stay either in Thailand or in this region. I went from Thailand to Japan. But in that time, as tends to happen, I got married to my Thai partner, my current wife, and started a family. And it became, easier for us to be based here than in other countries. So I came back to Thailand when my children were very young in 2006. My first child had just been born in 2005, and did a second stint here. And then the BBC said, well, it would be good to get you out of the region. And that's when they sent me to Istanbul. And I really enjoyed Istanbul. My wife did too. We had a great time. It was a fabulous city, and it was a fascinating time to be in that region. But at the end of my time there, and the BBC was wondering what else to do with me, they kind of changed philosophy. Previously, they liked to move people around like chess pieces all the time, but they felt that there was some advantage to people, getting to know a country well. And they were also very concerned about how the BBC would report the death of King Bhumibol when it happened. Of course, nobody knew when it would happen, but it was obviously a matter of time. And it was very sensitive. Nobody would talk about it. And they felt having an old hand back in Bangkok who kind of knew the sensitivities would probably be the best thing. So they also knew that it would probably suit me, because I have a half Thai family. My wife's family is still here. So we made the decision to come back. I didn't know how long it would be, but of course I came back in 2012, so that's now 8.5 years, and it looks like I'm staying for a while, I think.
And you're obviously very busy. This has been an incredible year, hasn't it? Obviously with COVID, but also with political changes. How have you managed to keep track of all of that? I mean, are you really busy? I mean,
at times, yeah. It comes and goes. I mean, the actual international interest in Thailand is very variable. People know Thailand because they come on holiday here, but it baffles them in terms of how the country works. Very few people know it. I'm supposed to cover the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, so before COVID hit, I would travel quite a lot. I'd spent quite a lot of time in Hong Kong in 2019. I've been to Myanmar quite a bit, although that's quite difficult, covering things like the Rakhine Rohingya crisis. I go to Malaysia quite a lot there when they have political problems. So, in days gone by, I go to the Philippines. I now have a colleague who reports there, and that takes the need off. So it was a broader brief. But once COVID hit, we were stuck here. And while there was some interest in what was going on in Thailand, pretty quickly, the COVID situation in Thailand was brought under control very effectively. It became a massive story in the US and Britain and other countries. So actually, at the beginning of last year, things got very quiet for us. We did do a big story looking at the future of tourism, with Thailand as an example of what happens when you lose your tourist economy. And then, of course, these protests began, and we were watching them. But there have been protests in Thailand before, and they were student-led. It wasn't clear, how far they were going to go. But once they brought the issue of the monarchy out into the open, I mean, it's an issue that we've always known is there, but of course is very difficult to talk about. And as a foreign correspondent, it's not my job to get involved in political disputes here or have any I don't have any stake in it. I am merely an observer, and I'm meant to reflect the debate that's going on in the country. And as long as the debate was very silent in Thailand and people feared speaking about it, I could refer to the kind of general climate of inhibition about the monarchy, that people felt they couldn't talk about it. But it was never a public issue, and it was very difficult for us to talk about it because of the laws. Once these students started saying, we want changes to the monarchy, I mean, we all looked at each other as foreign journalists, and we thought, well, where's the line now? What can we talk about this? And we thought, well, if they're doing it, we've at least got to reflect that they're asking for this, even if we have to be careful how we say it. And it just built up momentum. They became very, very bold. Some of the language at the protests about the monarchy and the royal family was quite shocking, actually. We realized things had really changed. Now, whether they've changed long-term or not, I don't know. I suspect the conversation about Thailand's political institutions, including the monarchy, is going to be different from now on than it was in the days of King Bhumibol. And I think that was probably inevitable anyway. Things do change. How much it changes, whether the government can put this genie back in the bottle, well, we'll simply have to see.
It's obviously all about self-censorship as well, which obviously every journalist really sort of doesn't want to get involved with. You have actually been charged with lèse majesté, haven't you, before?
Not charged.
No?
I had a complaint filed against. In fact, I had 3 complaints filed against me. My second stint here back in 2008. Anybody can file a lèse majesté complaint against anyone. That's part of the problem with the law. And when it was filed against me, I was a bit stunned. I had no idea. It turned out to be, although it was filed by a policeman, a police officer, and he wasn't the one behind it. He didn't speak a word of English. He had no idea what I'd reported. It was actually a British man who was aggrieved. He'd had a falling out with the Foreign Correspondents Club. Yeah. I'm a board member, although I wasn't involved in that particular dispute. It happened before my time. And he simply decided to cause some trouble and file this case. And it was absurd. It involved a complete mistranslation of things I'd reported and said. But, once the problem with lèse majesté is once it starts, it goes at you. Nobody understands the process. There's no point in getting a lawyer. The police take it on. It goes into a sort of these secret committees. And you won't know how far it's gone until they come and say, right, we're going to charge you. And once you're charged, your options are very, very limited. Very few people are ever acquitted. And almost everybody pleads guilty, gets a reduced sentence, but it can still be a pretty long one. And then you simply hope as a foreigner to get a pardon. I was very fortunate, being the BBC correspondent. I think people looked very hard at the complaint that was made against me and realised there was no substance in it, and they simply went away. But it was a worrying time.
It must have been.
I have also been prosecuted, but prosecuted for criminal defamation and under the Computer Crimes Act. But that was by a lawyer who I filmed and quoted in a report we did about a British and an Irish man who'd been scammed in Phuket. It was a local issue. And he simply used the law. And the problem in Thailand is almost every criminal complaint like that, and it didn't come from the police, it came from him straight to the courts, always gets taken up. So you have to go through the rather grueling process of going on trial, posting bail, having your passport taken. It took 18 months, a great deal, sadly, of the BBC's money. And eventually he dropped the charges because there really wasn't much behind them.
Yeah, it does strike me, actually, that your profession as a journalist can put you in some pretty precarious sort of situations. I mean, if you look at some of your correspondents out in the Middle East, very, very dangerous part of the world. And there are others who really do live right on the line. Are you living really on the edge? Do you feel fairly nervous?
It's not too bad for me. I mean, I'm not somebody who loves being right in the middle of danger. And I do have colleagues for whom that's the best possible story they can do. I've done a few combat gigs, and some of them were a bit hairy, but not very many. Thailand's different. I mean, the risk you have here, obviously, is getting caught up in this sort of legal web. But, in the end, these charges, although they go through the courts, to some degree, they're a political decision. And the most important thing as a correspondent, it's hard for us to know where the line is. The monarchy is a very sensitive issue. I understand it's sensitive for the government. It's sensitive for many Thais. I've been here long enough to know how difficult it is, and yet it's a very important institution, and it is my job to report it as fairly and as honestly as I can. And you mentioned self-censorship. We do self-censor, and I really regret having to do that. And we get criticised for basing ourselves here and allowing self-censorship. It is a debate about whether we should even be here if we're not able to report honestly. But we also have to manage our relationship with the authorities. We are guests here, and actually for all of Thailand's problems, it does accommodate a great many foreign journalists and does give us a good deal of leeway. It's almost impossible for me, for example, to report in Vietnam. That country is so tied down. I can't even report when I go on short visits there. So right. Thailand is far more accommodating of us, and we do appreciate that. And I do keep up a reasonable dialogue with the foreign ministry and with other senior Thai officials, just to let them know that, there's no ill intent. We want to explain Thailand in all its facets. And if they don't like something that we report, it's better if we try to have a discussion about it and see if there's a way of resolving it, rather than it coming to a high-profile trial. And, touch wood, but so far the Thai authorities have not prosecuted foreign journalists. I think it's far more difficult for Thai journalists. They're in a really difficult position because there's an expectation that they will toe the line. But they also, of course, have seen the discussion about the monarchy transformed over the last year, and they also need to reflect it. I mean, my BBC Thai colleagues, who have a mandate to go much further than the Thai media, that's what their job is, to provide stuff that the Thai media won't. They're in a very difficult position, and that is quite stressful for them, and they're far more stressful for them than it is for me.
What about news online? Some people tell me, I don't like the BBC so much nowadays because, I'm finding most of my news on social media. What's your opinion on social media and news?
Well, social media is a reality. You can't make it go away. It's had a massive impact on the entire news industry, and it's an enormous and existential challenge to traditional mainstream media, and the BBC is very much mainstream media. We have to make a new argument for why we should exist, why the public, the British public and the Foreign Office should fund us, and what we provide that the infinite space of social media doesn't provide. And I don't think any of the mainstream media have quite found the answer. Some have been more successful than others. The New York Times is the US paper of record, and perhaps because of the size of their market, they've managed to make the economics work, to get enough subscriptions to fund really good in-depth journalism. I'm often quite jealous of what my New York Times colleagues do, and they do put a lot of resources into the stories they care about. The BBC is more resource constrained, and because we are funded by the British public, because there's more and more people saying, well, I don't watch the BBC or I don't listen, why should I pay for it? And of course, the impact of COVID on the economy, all these factors are really very serious challenges. And I think we're still trying to find the answer. I think the best argument that we can make is that the BBC's stories are very carefully curated. There is a real determination to try to find a fair and balanced line. Now, it's very difficult to do in a polarized world, and we certainly don't do a perfect job at it. There's plenty of criticism of the BBC from its own staff, not just people outside. But perhaps it is fair to say there is a need in a world where there's such a diversity of reporting online for which you have no knowledge of what the foundation is. It's very hard to know whether something you read online has been properly researched, whether there's a real foundation to it or not. We live in a world where all sorts of wild conspiracy theories and crazy stories take off and get momentum when there's no foundation to them. You can at least be assured that the BBC is making its best efforts to provide something which is properly sourced, which is carefully reasoned out, and which is balanced with a range of opinions. That isn't always very exciting. It's going to be very hard for us to match the sheer thrill of more partisan media, but it does provide you with perhaps a middle reference point if you care about trying to get close to something we call the truth.
I wanted just to ask you a little bit about where sort of potential students should be looking, and if they're considering a career in journalism, any advice really, what they should be thinking about, where they should be studying, and what their focus should be?
I'm often asked this actually, and part of me feels journalism as a career has become so much harder than when I was so lucky. I joined the BBC at a time where there were resources available to train people. There was a career structure. There was a whole range of jobs you could move through to get experience, and it's much, much tougher. Most media organizations a lot of them have died, have gone out of business. They're trimmed down. They are very resource strapped, and they don't have a lot of capacity for training. So it's difficult to provide one path. The best way of becoming a journalist is to try to be one, to practice it, to write, to read the journalists you admire most, to read widely, to see how they report, and to look for niches, look for things that haven't been reported before. Even internships are tricky now because, I mean, for example, at the BBC now, we will no longer accept unpaid internships, and also there's a very strong, it's bound by very strict company regulations. They do not want it being done as favors for friends. There needs to be a very strict assessment. We don't provide very many internships, and they're all in London. We couldn't do it here in Bangkok. In days gone by, we could casually let somebody come in, sit in the office for a few weeks, come out on trips with us and see how we reported, and it was all done. We just can't do that anymore. Right. And so those sort of paths are not really available now. I mean, some people say, well, I better go and study journalism. There are some great journalism courses, and it gives you a fantastic grounding in the skills, the disciplines, the mindset that you need to be a good journalist. But there is nothing like practice. And the best thing I can say is it's very tough, and you can try offering pieces. Get to know journalists. If you've got a good story, see if you try writing something, try putting something together. If you get a great piece of video, these days most phones will shoot video, so long as you hold it reasonably steady and frame it properly in quality that's perfectly good enough to broadcast. We broadcast phone video all the time. Sure. You offer an interview if you've seen something dramatic. See if you can find someone who can get you put on air. But there is no obvious path. Eventually, if people see you doing it and they see you've got a spark and some ability, there are possibilities. In London, the BBC, particularly BBC World, there are freelance shifts available on the rolling programmes. They're hard to get, but they are there. And many people I know have started at the very bottom in the BBC, doing casual shifts at first, eventually getting a contract, and if they're good, working their way up to where they're recognised, and somebody says, well, how about you go out and do some reporting? But it is a tough game now. If you're really keen, it's the best fun you can have in the world, but you won't get rich. And I often say to young people who look at me, and I've just turned 60. I've been reporting overseas for 25 years, and I say to them, look, I've had the best time of my life. It's a the BBC's been a wonderful employer. It's a fantastic institution, but I have not had a promotion in 25 years. I'm doing the same job I did 25 years ago. That's what you do as a foreign correspondent. Right. You're not doing it for the money. I don't know whether you're doing it for the glory or not. I'm not sure, but you're doing it for the fun. But most of all, you do it because there is such an immense privilege in having a seat, a front row seat on the big events in history, to be able to witness countries in this region that fascinate me, and societies, countries I love, all the trials and tribulations they go through, and to be close up and see, watch history being made and see them struggling to sort themselves out and get through things. That's been such an enormous privilege, and it's one I still treasure.
Jonathan, thank you so much for having a chat with us today. It's been really great. Terrific.
Lovely to talk to you as well.
Yeah. Do stay safe, won't you?
Will do. Thanks very much.
Surf 102.5 Podcast.